Okay. Welcome to the grand final of the General League YTN Huffs English Debate Tournament. Congratulations on making it to the finals. I'll be chairing this round. I am the DCA of this tournament. My name is Yoon Sung Pong, and with me I have Banu Sabri, Chris Carlos, Mika Jazavri, Sanjivan Raha, Lee Ji-yoon, and Haejun Jang. Now, we're under the motion that assuming technology exists, this house would get rid of depression. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to the podium.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Depression chains individuals down to a cycle of toxicity where they can't escape the social discontent and disconnect over a long period of time. We give a key to escape to these individuals prior to propose. Let me define and clarify the key terms of this motion. 2 things. Number 1, what is depression and what is not? A, it is fundamentally a different thing from the concept of sadness because depression is a long-term phenomenon that does not stay permanently in most cases. But B, depression also leads to real-life impacts influencing people's way to think and act. Thus, it's just not like an individual problem, it's a collective societal problem, and it may cause third-party harms. Number 2, by getting rid of depression, the concept of depression, we have to assume that we have the technicalities to make depression disappear, and thus this debate is not really about how we reach this emotion and how we get rid of depression. The likely world without depression would look like aggregate increase in happiness and positivity, and there will still be feelings of sadness under our side too, but that sadness would not be long-term, it will be very short-term and easier to move on. Making that clarified, let me go on to my first argument then, explaining about how it makes people more rational. 3 layers of analysis. A, depression is a dominant emotion and a mental illness that overrides other conscious thinking and other trains of thought. Because when you're overly sad, you tend to only think about the factor that makes you depressed again and again, and you are trapped in the cycle of thinking. This leaves no space for rational thinking because the discontent and the sadness that you feel dominates over any other rational thought. So thank you. Then B, what specific benefits do we bring under this characterization? 1, we allow individuals to rather take alternatives rather than to stay weak and powerless. Well, what does this mean? We think that there are various factors that can cause depression in today's society. Things like social oppression, breaks up, financial lack and social disconnect. Please use your papers. Please verbal POIs. And this actually forces individuals to be mentally changed, right? A common characteristic of depression is that it makes people unable to fight back against these factors. Under our side, when this mental chain disappears, it allows space for rational thinking. And this means that under our side, victims of such social oppression is likely going to be futuristic and long-term. They won't be changed in short-term thoughts at the end. They can have room to find ways to combat against the factors that cause depression. I'll take it after this argument. But secondly, we think that we also allow less time to be wasted because sadness at best is a short-term emotion under our side. People can actually move on quicker from miseries and have a better quality life in general. Because if you break up, you can recover quicker and for example, if you break up, you can recover quicker from that relationship, find a new partner rather than being shackled in the thought that you cannot move on from the past. But 3, and finally, we also think that we can increase the aggregate happiness of society because we at least eradicate one factor that makes people sad. Because people are not able to move on, they're better because people are able to move on under our side, they're better able to access the sources of happiness that they can access to. They can find their essential dreams and hobbies only under our side because they have the mental capacity to do so, and they're not overridden by the feeling of sadness. But see, finally, the opposition might say that depression strengthens the bond between individuals and gives lessons towards individuals, and thereby it is needed for society and whatnot. 2 layers of analysis. 1, the best lesson that you can get out of depression is to move on, to actually move on from the past. And we get this lesson right away because there is no need for moving on because there is no emotion of depression to begin with. But second, we also think that sadness is an existing emotion under our side, and that can give enough lessons for individuals if there's needed if the lessons are needed to begin with. Because of this, we think that opposition is the team that needs to prove why depression is the only way to go and the only way to get lessons at the end. But before I move on to my second argument, I'll take a POI.
So if you think that extreme emotions are a bad thing for rationality, are you against for all extreme emotions at the end of the day?
No, we think that depression is fundamentally different from all other extreme emotions. Why? Because depression actually leads to real-time actions and real-time consciousness. We think that other factors, such as rage, for example, is comparatively easier to get away with, because depression is a mental illness that chains people down. Other emotions can be easily got over with and thereby return to normal life. But this is because this is a mental illness is fundamentally different. But let's move on to our second argument then, explaining about how it minimizes harm to oneself and the society. A, we think that depression actually does not end as an individual harm, but also third-party harms. Because individuals are characteristically and mentally unstable, when they are in depression, they're likely to want to escape reality, and that is shown through high rates of suicide or alcohol addiction rates in today's society, which are methods and the substances for these individuals to actually escape the never-ending pain that results from depression to begin with. But B, opposition might say and cannot say that such problems can be solved through simple methods of therapy and mental medication under their side, because that is very mitigatory to begin with, but because of three main reasons. One, those are currently only accessible to the rich and wealthy individuals, right? Because the minorities are not given access and minorities suffer the most from these depression and such social oppression, we think that it does not do any benefits towards these minorities who are the most vulnerable actors. But two, having a mental illness in today's society is heavily stigmatized. The moment you come out as depressed, it means that you are seen as weak and comparatively weak than other people. Thus, people under our side, people in today's society don't want to visit hospitals if there is one, so thereby the access to mental hospitals and therapies are at best mitigatory towards individuals who are depressed because of the fact that they don't want to come out as depressed. But three, fundamentally, we think that we are the ones that ultimately always comparatively solve the problem better, because we completely eradicate the feeling of depression, and there is no other way in which depression can exist and thereby influence people to make bad decisions or whatnot under our side, because depression does not only end to harms to oneself, but also to the third party and also to society. Depression is a feeling that needs to be stopped and eradicated. We're the ones that do that, proud to propose.
Thank you. The speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 21 seconds. Now I'd like to move on to the leader opposition. But before that, please note that you shouldn't be having verbal POIs, but rather using the paper for POIs. Thank you.
Am I audible? Okay.
Speaker, let's start by explaining how people get depression or how depression exists within the status quo. We think that it's mainly a product of the environment, and it's mainly when individuals feel like they have no hope. So for example, when there's a relative deprivation and you feel that you are not able to have things that other individuals have, or when you feel the pressure from elitist society and they feel that you are undermined or your values undermined in this type of society, or when you're receiving certain types of discrimination that are things or factors that you cannot control. When we look at these examples, it's when these individuals cannot have hope, or when they cannot actively directly change something by their own help. And that's why we think that it's not necessarily the responsibility or the product of these individuals. And that's why, before anything, we would like to also clarify that what the opposition team wants to support is having a counter policy or having more instances within the society where the government can provide facilities, or the government can provide more therapists or aid to these individuals to help the mental state and get the change that we want to have within the society. So we think that when the society is problematic, or the main question in this debate is when we understand that there's problems within society, do we simply evade these problems, or do we actively deal with it, and do we try to change this? Do we change the society, or do we simply change the people no thank you. So let's go on to my rebuttals before I go into my arguments. They talked about how like, oh, now we're only going to have short-term emotions, but they never explained why this is something that is naturally going to be good. We think that this is not something that the opposition team would always want to support because there's no direct understanding regarding these types of emotions or coming from the exact cause of them. And that's why they also talked about how like, oh, rationality is like going to be you can't be rational if you have extreme emotions. And then, but they didn't talk about other things such as anger issues, or when you have constant happiness, or when you are simply enlightened by this type of issue or by these type of situations that you can't think rationally. If rationality is going to be their main metric, they need to prove why they're not willing to support any other things. And then they talked about how like, oh, but right now the rich individuals can only be saved from like breakups, for example. Firstly, their limited scope is too small. If they focus on things such as breakups, then that's not necessarily a very urgent issue that we understand within the society. No, thank you. And also, we don't necessarily think that it's only going to be the rich because the government already has an active interest to help these depressed people, as we see from the existence of this motion itself. So let's go on to our arguments. Firstly, about why the opposition team is actively or completely capable of changing these types of problems that we understand within the status quo. So when we look at the steps to changing a problem, it's firstly going to be the recognition of a problem. Secondly, going to be the collective mass, or when individuals or society understands that this is collectively that this is a problem, I'll take it later, and they have a consistent effort to be able to change this. So when we are able to recognize the problem, then you need to feel something, and that's why we think that depression or these types of long-term emotions are going to be crucial to recognizing the problem and recognizing that this situation is not good for me and there's something that needs to change. And when you don't realize this type of problem, then even if you're going through these not good situations or situations that negatively affect you, you don't necessarily feel the need for change. You're just like, I guess that is how it is, and I guess that is simply how it affects me. And that's why if we want more collective change, and if we actually talk about what the society should be doing and their role within these types of problems that come from the environment or come from the society, we want that where we are able to share the responsibility, where there's more interest, there's more relatable individuals, where people are saying, hey, I went through that same problem and I'm able to relate with you because I went through these extreme emotions and I want to be able to change this. I don't want to feel these types of negative emotions anymore. And that's why we are able to, that's the main reason why these individuals are more able to strive for the happiness, because they know the negative emotions, because they know why this is negatively affecting them. Yes?
Let us start by saying that we will also provide more therapists in medical centers. Isn't that just admitting that depression indeed is a problem?
We're not necessarily saying that depression is not an issue and depression is not something that individuals should always be having. We're simply saying that there are better ways for these individuals to naturally proceed through this, or the importance of feeling these emotions or understanding or recognizing these types of emotions and the problem that they get from themselves and the reason to these types of mental illnesses. So why is the opposition or why is the proposition unable to have these types of societal roles or more collective changes? Because firstly, again, we introduced to you why they're not able to understand the importance, why they're unable to understand the unfairness or the types of bad emotions that they are able to feel when they go through these wrong types of situations. But at the same time, it's going to be very, very minimal because, as they said, types of basic emotions that are so short term, they're much more minimal and they're less extended. So because they're fleeting emotions, they're not able to bring the same type of social change or bring the same type of social recognition that these other individuals will have. And that's why it's simply in the process of evading the problems. Even if you think that it is, it's like, hey, you know what? We just want to tell you it's not going to be a problem anymore. And they simply just turn the problem away and they don't actively try to solve it. And that's why we think that the reason why even the opposition team is going to be able to bring more diverse emotions or even the more objectively better emotions such as happiness is because individuals are able to constantly strive for this, because they don't want to be in the situation where they're depressed. They are going to constantly try to do things that are going to make them more happy, or they're going to try to be in a better situation that is actively going to make them more happy, because the quality of the situation is not going to be the same within the first place. So okay, let's talk about why the process of getting out of depression is something that we value and something that is very important within the society. Because in the process of changing or recognizing that you have depression, in changing your situations and doing these things, we think that you are one, actively empowered through this process, understanding that you are not actually someone who has no hope, or you are not someone who is able to do nothing within society, but also two, you're able to realize more emotions, you're able to value your life more. And that's why certain other things or certain irrational actions that individuals do out of depression, we think that we're able to understand, make these individuals individuals understand more the value of their life, the reason why they're continuously living for a happier life or a better quality life, why they want to continuously strive so that they can receive more benefits out of their life, because they're able to understand what type of emotions I was losing out on, or what type of negative effects that depression has on me, and how I can actively change the situation by demanding for the government to change it, or actually demanding for the environment around me to change. And because we think that this type of active empowerment or changing the society is much more beneficial, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you for listening.
The speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to the podium.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two main problems with the POI that Warwick gave you to our side's first speaker. He asked you about whether we're willing to get rid of all extreme emotions, right? The first problem with this POI is the fact that we don't have the burden to prove to you in today's debate about whether we're going to get rid of all extreme emotions or not. We're only here to discuss this issue of depression because this motion says that we're only having the technologies to get rid of depression, not other extreme emotions. But secondly, and more importantly, we're not saying that all extreme emotions are necessarily bad, right? For example, being really happy and euphoric after you win YTN, I think that's not something that we want to get rid of, right? Because if they think that we should be defending this, they're debating a completely wrong and irrelevant motion. They're debating the motion of this house would get rid of extreme emotions, not this house would get rid of depression. I think that's a completely irrelevant POI. I just wanted to point that out. Let's also talk about their counter policy. They said that they want more instances of facilities and therapists, those kinds of people and institutions that try to help out with your mental state when you're depressed. Well, a few things about that as well. Number one, and most problematically, this is their side basically admitting that depression is a problem, right? They're basically admitting that depression is problematic in the first place by making this claim. Well, if it is problematic, why don't you just get rid of it in the first place? Because isn't that the whole purpose of therapists, to help you escape depression? Isn't the whole purpose of mental health institutions to help you improve your mental health? If that's the problem that they identify to you in today's debate, I think we're the ones that provided the solution, ergo we should take this debate home. But second of all, even if what I just told you was wrong, I think it's still problematic. Their counter model is still problematic. Why? Because even though it may get like a little more accessible, for example, I think that's still, this is limited to the privileged, the rich. Why? Because of the fact that depression, well, first of all, because of the fact that I'll take you in a moment, because depression is still a concept that's not too normalized in society. It's a concept that's still considered something that's stigmatized, as we told you before. It's something that makes you feel inferior. It's something that makes you feel weak. This is the reason as to why a lot of people cannot actually access centers in the first place, not to mention the costly prices. But even though the government makes like a few more centers that try to cater to the needs of these depressed individuals, that does not mean that you actually make more people reach out to it in the first place, especially since the previous speaker never mechanized as to how they're planning to attract more people in the first place, right? Because just because you make more facilities doesn't mean that more people necessarily reach out to you. For example, what about like, I don't know, a poor person, like a poor woman who got raped in the workplace and is really afraid to open up about her depression because that might lead to her being further defamed, that might lead to her being further degraded, and she doesn't want that. I think that those kind of people, you can never actually relate to them. You can never actually pull them to actually discuss their depression, and those kinds of things are still really prevalent issues in the status quo. You don't do anything to help these people just by creating a few more like centers to help discuss about their depression. It's something that's really unrelatable to the vast majority of people. You don't help these stakeholders in today's debate. Before going to the next point of rebuttal, sure, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so if you think that the government can provide and delete the depressions that individuals feel, then why can't they delete, or why can't they provide more therapies for those individuals as well, respectively?
Yeah, okay, so you can provide more therapy, sure. The thing is, that does not mean that more people necessarily reach out to the therapist in the first place, right? Because of the fact that, as I just told you before, what about like a poor woman who got raped in the workplace and is simply too afraid to open up about her past experiences? Just because you provide a few more therapists, that does not mean that more people necessarily will reach out to you in the first place, unless you, for example, I don't know, get rid of the problem of rape or etc. I think that just does not mean that you're solving this entire problem of people feeling such depressed emotions, and therefore you guys, that problem still perpetuates on your side, especially considering that you admit to the problematic nature of depression. I think you've already lost this debate. Let's next talk about the point in his speech in which she talks about how society understands that depression is a problem that leads to long-term emotions, and that's crucial to recognizing problems and etc. First of all, the realization that there's a problem, like that itself is not the concept of depression, right? Depression is rather like what happens to you after you realize that there is a problem. You rather spiral into the state in which, as an impulse like literally defines, right? It's not the realization of the problem itself. Because there are, for example, people who identify a problem and still don't get depressed. What about these people, right? Are they just not part of the society? Also, when she talks about how you're not willing to connect with, you're able to connect with more people, you're able to form, meaningful connections with people because of the fact that you're depressed and therefore you can connect with them and whatever. I think that number one, the people that will connect with you, even if you are depressed, are your closest friends. It's your family, your friends, those people that you're already close with. Like depression is not necessarily something that makes you closer to them. Rather, when you're depressed, the people who you're already close to are the ones who come and form like closer bonds with you, right? The thing is that these people exist under our side too. If you have best friends under their world, you have best friends under our world too. The same bonds exist under our side. I don't necessarily understand how depression is conducive to letting you, I don't know, like make more friends or etc. and making more human connections because, as I said before, the very people who will help you are the ones that are already close to you in the first place. But if that's the case, second of all, with those friends that are like existing under both their side and our side, you can bond over other emotions that are existent under our world too. For example, the extreme euphoria you feel after winning a debate tournament, you can connect with people over this, right? In fact, I think it's actually a lot better to connect over emotions like this because it's actually not as toxic as such emotions and actually can spread more happiness to a lot more people. And they never really explain to you as to why depression is so exclusive in being able to form such human connections in the first place. So I think that basically things like happiness, they're all long-term emotions too. They simply never really mechanized enough as to why this long-term nature of depression is so integral in making you learn new things and making societal changes. For third of all, I think that actually depression, the problem with that is that at least it actually leads to strain in human connections, not what they tell you, right? Because I think that when you're depressed, what most people opt into is that they stay cloistered in their room. They stay in the corner of the room crying and just being depressed and sad and like squandering their time, right? I think that these people are the ones who actually opt into drugs, alcohol, and other alternatives that we don't think are that healthy and that we want to get rid of this root cause. We want to get rid of this root cause of the problem in the first place. I think that the reason why they debate like this is because they've only read success stories about depression. Like people have overcome it perfectly well. People have reached out to such therapists that they mentioned. I don't think that they're actually talking about their worst case and most realistic scenario because that's the most realistic thing that's going to happen on their side. That most people will spiral into those problems like drugs. Most people will spiral into alcohol, domestic violence, and other third-party harms, which we want to avoid under our side of the house. Because we want to form more happy and healthy connections between people because we want to get rid of this root cause of depression that even they admit to in today's debate. I am more than proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you. The speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 10 seconds. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to the podium.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Because depression is a significant problem that we have already consented to, that they didn't listen to our first speaker, it is the utmost goal of the government to combat and tackle the root cause and the problem, the environment and the circumstances that cause things like depression, things like negative experiences. We exclusively do this job by focusing on the societal movement and societal changes that can simply and only be motivated in the largest extent by pathos, emotionally appealing to this idea and making this a significant problem. That is how we make change, not by simply deleting the problem, so it would not be a form of discussion from the get-go. We believe that that is an innate problem that exists. The way I'm going to execute my speech is I'm going to bring up 2 contentious questions in debate and respond to how each of the sides has responded to this question. So first of all, can people really make rational choices in the first place? Is this important? When they first come to this podium and said about how we make people more rational and depression is special because it's an illness and so significant, we explicitly told you that they have to be against all extreme emotions. Even if they say we don't have the burden to prove why other extreme emotions don't exist. No, they do have the burden to prove why every other extreme emotions will exist, because their justifications for having this was by saying that people will now only make rational decisions in long term and therefore is something beneficial, so every other term will not exist. And because this is that reason and the logic why they have insisted against this Korean idea of happiness or extreme choices or etc. This is a burden they have to prove. No engagement, no answer, that directly rebuts to this problem. But then now there is a different answer, a different question about who better solves the problem, because that was identified from the get-go. And the only analysis they came from their side was something like, oh, we delete depression, so it's not significant. But then the problem here was that they had constantly said things like, oh, therapy, mental mitigation is impossible because only rich people get to have it. But then they were trying to play the eating up debate, being very sly in this debate. And the reason for that is that if you consider the fiat of the debate, this means that the government is willing to look at all these specific cases of all individuals to potentially suffer and is willing to be accessible. And therefore, if accessibility cannot happen on our side, it can't also happen on their side, because consider the field of the debate. They can't simply be sly, be very like sly with their things and eat up all our models, because that would simply not work in their society. But then their response was this, is like, oh, but we could do this, we could do this too. We could also do mental and therapy, whatever that is. The problem with this is that they have no incentives to make change, and because this incentive do not exist, the consequences do not prolong. And what this means is that because the consequences of depression no longer exist on their side in the long term, they have no incentives to provide long-term direct solutions that combat the root cause of this problem. And that is the reason that they're incapable of solving this problem at the end of the day, because if consequence is not big, the incentive to solve this problem is minimal as well. We don't necessarily know how they're going to solve the problem, but that doesn't exist on their side. Yes, PY?
Sure, you might make therapists accessible to everyone, but that does not mean that a person who got raped and doesn't want to open up about our experiences is suddenly going to be opening up to it.
Okay, that was our next point. And now they come up and say things like not directly rebutting to our problem, like, oh, but how about stigmas? Or how about like these people not reaching out? Madam and judges, they said that it's also a significant problem, depression, because depression is such a significant problem, and it's important to provide solutions. And there was their logical mechanisms. But if this was true, if this was such a significant problem in the society, why would people think like trying to solve a significant problem as such something bad, something evil to do? Why would individuals simply opt out of the significant problem and say, oh, actually, I think it's against my stigmatized idea. I won't do this because I care for societal perception, for example. We believe that their characterization is combating and targeting their own logic because they simply want to rebut the idea, and they're simply rebutting to rebut. And we don't necessarily think that is going to be the true case that can buy in at the end of the day. And now because we proved to you why we better solve the problem, how they're going to be incapable of fully legitimizing this idea of rational choice that simply does not exist on their side. Let me now tell you why is it important to make societal movement into societal changes. The reason why this is the case is, Mr. Speaker, is let me give you two examples. One, let's say that there is like a very isolated individual who lives by their own, doesn't have any societal contact, and therefore experiences depression. In their side, how they're going to solve this problem is by just deleting that sense of depression and just leave that individual live alone with like no societal connection, because that they have no incentive to change. Individuals have no incentive to change because there's no depression. But in our side, we collectively make societal movements and societal progress by bringing out from that isolation and polarization, by simply bringing in people and saying that this is a significant problem, we have to solve this, and because the long-term emotions exist, we solve the problem. The problem with the government side is that even if there is sadness, the only emotions that will prolong at the end of the day are short-term, fleeting, very ephemeral emotions that give no impact to changing the behavior. Because we give long-term, impactful emotions that changes the sentiments, the same changes of life, the behaviors, the habits of the individuals. That is why change can happen. That is why change is important, and their side is incapable of bringing those long-lasting, strong arguments out of the way. Now, let me prove you why societal movement can happen in ours exclusively. We've told you already that societal movement can best be intrigued with things like pathos, things like emotion, things like empathy, sympathy, something that we can simply cohere to and be attached to, because intimacy is what we go for, and by implying the significance of the depression and its problem. And if this is the case, that this can never happen in their side, because no one thinks that depression is a significant problem, because there's no consequence simply out of this problem, and therefore is the reason why they will be incapable of assaulting the critical mass of the individuals, bring out sympathy, bring out societal network and changes that can practically solve the problem. We believe that we want to achieve a society where we actually solve the root cause of the problem, the habits, the individual livelihood, the circumstances in which these people live in, and therefore can be the legitimate, responsible government, not fleeting out from their responsibilities. And therefore is the reason why we oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for the speech. The speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 11 seconds. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to the podium.
I like to start in 3, 2, 1. Two things to clarify before moving on to my two clashes. First is about the extension that they talk about how there is no sympathy or empathy on our side. That's somehow a bad problem. But I think that's just not true, because throughout this debate, they tend to keep on like forgetting that there are other ways of getting these emotional aspects. There are other ways of getting recognition, the process of learning about yourself or expanding more about yourself and your value of life or whatever, right? Because these are things that you can clearly get in other ways. For example, sympathy and empathy, right? These are things that you can still get without dating a person that is depressed, right? For example, let's say I'm working, I tend to be a little bit skinny, right? Or whatever, I tend to be a little bit fat or whatever. Like if that's the case, then if I work out a little bit and then I start showing my progress and stuff, but I'm still like, not there yet, people might feel like sympathy for me, empathy for me, right? Like those are the kind of cases that can still happen. Now, I don't exactly see the impact here as to why sympathy and empathy isn't even important, right? Because they keep on saying like, oh, these connections that you can make to depression is so important. Well, we clearly told you that that's not the only way you can get the connections. And if your only way of getting connections is through depression, that's pretty unhealthy, right? Because there are clearly other ways, such as through happiness, or other kinds of certain events, or in like a school or whatever. Like these are the kind of different events or certain emotions of that you can use in order to get more connections, right? So I think that this like extension didn't really have any impacts. I just felt like it was there because they needed an extension, right? But also they talked about how we need to prove all long-term emotional conditions because people become irrational if that happens, right? Okay, first of all, we don't have the burden to prove this whatsoever because we don't even have the technology. But second of all, we don't exactly know what all long-term emotional like these conditions are. I think it's pretty hard for us to just go one by one and be like, maybe that one, maybe not that one. And in some cases, maybe being a little bit irrational is a better thing to do, right? If you're really happy, maybe you can be, very happy and go on your own. Maybe that might give you more happiness. That's what you want, right? In some cases, maybe being a little bit irrational is fine. But I think especially in this case of depression, we are choosing to get rid of it. I don't think it's our burden whatsoever. They just made the debate very messy. So let's move on to the first class and the second class. The first class is more about the individual's emotional status. So I'd like to first talk about recognition and connections. So first, when it comes to recognitions, I think this is not really a part of the depression whatsoever, because you can still recognize that there is a problem without being depressed about it, right? So we think that this whole idea of the process of recognition and identifying a problem is just not part of depression. I don't think that makes any sense. Let's move on to something more important about the idea of connections. I have to make some comparatives as to why there are other better ways. First, the problem with their side is that first, not everyone can get connections at the first place. They say that therapists are all going to somehow be available for everybody. I will still accept this, right? I'll still say, even if that's true, I think still there are going to be people that are not really going to reach out to these therapists, even rich people that has been sexually assaulted or has gone through traumatic experiences. Sometimes just don't ask for therapists because they don't feel like they want it and they don't feel like they need it, right? If the other side is somehow going to keep pushing this idea that it's still like people do it because it's a big big topic now. Depression is a big thing in society. I think they're just overreaching at this point, right? But also, second of all, sometimes therapists aren't enough. Therapists sometimes don't work all the time, right? Sometimes you need people that are special to you, like a family member or friends. But not everybody has that as well. Sometimes because of the stigmatization of the depression, I think it's also going to lead to people ignoring you, also making fun of you, right? But also, second of all, some people make even more enemies during the process of depression, right? Because you tend to be irrational at those times. You might say certain bad things about other people when you're irrational. You might have some kind of anger against that person while you're sad as well. I think these are the kind of things that can also happen on their side where you're much more irrational and can make even more enemies instead of making more connections. But third, it's just an unhealthy way to rely on depression as a main source of making friends. I just don't think that's a good idea. On the comparative, what's better is first, make connections through happiness as well, because we think that it's much healthier and most likely you won't make enemies because the overall attitude is much positive, and especially in these cases you can make more connections, right? I think that it's just not really a good argument to say, depression is important because you can make connections when there are other healthier ways to do so, right? But also another comparative about the idea of learning about yourself. I think there are so many other alternatives as well, such as making more connections and for example, even through the idea of happiness. I think in that situation you can still make meaningful lessons about yourself, and even in the situation of where you go through certain tough situations, I think you can still rationally analyze and be like, hey, maybe I should move on. I should maybe next time not do this. Especially if it's a situation where you lost your family member. I think instead of wasting time and being depressed, you're more likely to be like, hey, now I need to make a rational decision that I should stop crying, stop being depressed, maybe spend more time with my family members so that I don't go through this experience again, right? Those are the rational decisions that most likely people will make on our side. For those reasons, it is much better, right? So let's move on to a second class about the idea of inequality. And this especially talks more about the idea of not everybody gets a therapist. And especially for those reasons, we think that it does not make any sense. But for them to just blatantly go we'll just afford therapists for everybody, inequality, that's not going to solve anything, right? Because we think that under our side, we'll have even more economic gap because we get to get rid of, all the therapists, medical centers, suicide hotlines, all these kind of different resources that we always spend in order to get rid of depression, which is billions and billions of dollars, instead to improve the social economic conditions of the people, right? Before moving on, I'll take a POI.
Now, how are people going to go for deleting the depression on your side if the stigma is too big?
I think it's pretty clear. Like, we're getting rid of depression, meaning this kind of idea of like stigma can be overcome much easier. Or people tend to, if they have been sexually assaulted, they try to think like logically, what can I do in this situation? Maybe I can reach out for help. Maybe I can reach out for the idea of making a proper case so that I can get, vengeance on this guy that has done this. I can get proper justice. These are the kind of rational choices that people are most likely to make instead of being depressed or not coming out of certain situations, right? Or they can just do whatever they want in terms of what's the rational choice that they think is, instead of being irrational in the depressed state, right? Because we have already told you in terms of inequality, we can improve the people's socioeconomic standards by not spending money on these things to improve depression. Because I think the moment that they say we need these kind of things, it's just admitting that depression as an overall is a problem. And if they need it to the extent where every single person needs a therapist, there's clearly the problem with the idea of depression at the first place. I think for those reasons, it just doesn't make sense for them to go all that much of an overreach to the extent where they're basically getting rid of depression, right? Because if they say that these therapists are so good and they're going to give it to every single person, there's nothing like different from our cases, right? Because even they want to get rid of depression as an overall now, right? Also at the end, because we create a more positive society as an overall, people have a much better interaction because instead of getting depressed, they're more positive towards each other. I think that's the kind of society that we want to create, and already a hyper-competitive society. And for these reasons, I'm more than proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 24 seconds, and then I'd like to invite the opposition whip to the podium.
Am I audible? Yeah, all right. All right. My speech will begin in 3, 2, and 1. When life gives you lemonade, you don't drain it or trash it down the bin. What you do is you make lemonade out of it, right? And we think that that's the exact problem existed upon team government, because as soon as some sort of problem exists under their side of the house, they're simply avoiding it. They're simply saying that, well, that seems to be a problem. Let's get over it. Let's just eradicate it. You think that that kind of narrative is a world where societal progress, which was clearly strongly pushed upon our first two constructive speakers, which was never mentioned, right? You think that this itself is going to be a huge part of this debate and why they lose this ultimately at the end of the day, which is going to be my second clash. But firstly, in order for some clarification to happen, let's firstly talk about like the justification behind erasing these sorts of memories, justification behind erasing these sorts of individuals' depression or whatnot. So what we hear from team government is that the only justification or the only reason why depression is bad is because depression hinders people from making rational decisions. And in extension to that, they talk about how, well, because they are irrational, they resort to things like they take drugs, they take alcohol, whatnot. So several responses to this, right? Number one, what's the prerequisite for making a rational decision, right? Because when their first speaker comes up to the podium characterizing how the world is now going to be composed of ephemeral emotions, you think that that means the very basis for you to come up with a rational thinking process needs and requires you to actually have a comprehensive understanding, for you to actually have a long-term memory about things. But when you are simply vacant, you are simply in a blank slate, because you do not have any sort of antithesis acting upon your mind, then it's impossible for you to actually make a certain decision at the end of the day. We think that those kinds of antitheses are also essential in making a rational decision. But more importantly, we also believe on the fact of how we think that these sorts of extremely hard or brutal emotions or these kinds of sorrow makes you make irrational decisions somehow, which was never elaborated. But yeah, then it's going to be harmful at the end of the day. So we think that the general premise itself is that these kinds of irrational emotions, these kinds of certain extreme or certain emotions of certain magnitude are going to be harmful for you at the end of the day. That means, so we constantly question team government about, well, then are you against like extreme emotions at the end of the day? The only response that we heard from team government was that, well, depression's a little different because it makes you like make certain dreadful consequences or whatnot. So we think that at the end of the day, the very question that we have to raise is the fact of how depression, you having extremely, according to their side, having this sort of sorrow about themselves or whatnot is going to be so harmful at the end of the day. I'll take you after this class, right? But then we also have this idea of, will we have a solvency mechanism? Because they have this consistent ping pong debate about, well, there's no accessibility at the end of the day because only rich people have access to therapists. All right, we don't necessarily think that this fiat of the debate lets us assume that the government is going to be able to identify individuals suffering from depression. Then if we can give some sort of, I don't know, some pills so that they can erase their depression or whatnot, then why can we single out those individuals and give them therapy? We don't necessarily see a question to that. And stigma, because they agree that depression is such a significant problem that means at the end of the day, those kinds of stigma are not going to be severely great, because at the end of the day, those individuals or the whole demographic of society is a world or cluster of individuals suffering from depression. Then there's more critical mass, there's more motivation for individuals to team up and talk about these issues. Before we move on to our second clash, because we already justified how the justification doesn't exist, let's take a PO lecture.
What's exactly different between our case and your case, where your case, as the second speaker said, would have therapists for every single person and also guarantee that most of the things will be successful?
Yeah, so the difference would be, under your side of the house, this just acts as a great transition for our second class. Your side of the house, you have ephemeral emotion. You have things like funniness. Yay, I'm happy because I want some sort of thing. Or B, I have this sort of anger and therefore I'm angry, and that's the end of it. So your society would be a world in which short-term emotions are the sole metric in the actual emotions that you feel, or the realm or the spectrum of your emotions. Why is it comparatively bad? Because at the end of the day, what this means is that the very stake of your action impacting another individual is not that big. What do I mean by this? Because if I dump someone else, someone I love miserably, the stake of that in status quo is very great, because those individuals are going to suffer from depression, obviously. But under their side of the house, what those individuals who I have severely inflicted upon, those individuals will just walk away. Then why is that bad? Because the very society that they are living in is a society where the choices or the words or actions that you make do not necessarily have a severe consequence of those actions. Then why is that bad? Because at the end of the day, we want to live in a society where every single individual are careful about their actions. But under their side of the house, because of those ephemeral actions, because you give them like a winning state, you give them an excuse because you're not, that individual is not going to suffer severely, you're giving them an excuse, you're giving a ticket for those individuals to alleviate and justify their actions. That is a more irresponsible society. So the society that we would rather live in is a society where we know the problem, right? We know what's happening, because the very existence or acknowledgement of depression means that we are also going to look into the very causes of that depression. This is only exclusive under our side of the house, because at the end of the day, individuals are having long-lasting problems. Just like they say, individuals are having significant problems, and that means we have more of the incentive compared to their side, because those are ephemeral emotions and those are short-term. That side does not happen. So we make a more responsible society. No justification, more than proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker. The Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 33 seconds. And before proceeding to opposition reply, please put your mask on properly. Whenever you're ready.
Speaker, let's start with the exclusive benefits that each side has characterized. The government's team said that, oh, now you can get more friends and build more stable relationships because you don't have depression. They also said you don't feel extreme emotions and you only feel short-term emotions, and therefore that is good in and of itself. And then they lastly talked about how, oh, you're not going to get stuck on a breakup anymore. And that's why these are such amazing benefits. So let's just say that we increase the scale of their benefits, and because they don't feel this type of mental trauma, because they don't feel this type of mental stress, they're able to live more free lives, and because of this, they're able to be more enabled in what types of lives that they live. We still think that when we talk about the types of benefits that the opposition team is able to provide, the problems that we identify within the status quo about how we're going to be able to strive for more social change, why we have more social recognition against these issues, and why we actively try to understand that there are problems that we must need to change or we must need to reform within the society. We still think that our changes are more valuable, especially because what the proposition team is simply trying to do is that if there's an elephant in the room that you must address, what they want to do is simply take a pill and pretend that you cannot see it anymore. No, and when you cannot see it anymore, you simply pretend that it does not exist. What opposition team would like to do is that they would like to bring more people to talk about the elephant, to recognize that the elephant exists, and so that they can resolve the elephant that exists within the room. So let's talk about how we can do this, and let's talk about the sympathy and empathy point that they talked about. Proposition talked about how, like, oh, why is empathy even important? Because they said that we never recognize, but we explained from our very first speaker why it is important that people relate, so we can build a critical mass, so people understand and people feel intimate to this issue, and they understand why going through these types of emotions and why the situation that makes them go through these emotions is something that is bad, and that is very crucial to recognizing the problem. And then they talked about how, like, oh, but like our metric is simply going to be what is irrational. And then they said that, like, irrationality is only going to be specific to depression because it just is. So sometimes they said that sometimes irrational choices can also be good. So their principle wasn't properly defended within the first place. So we would like to ask counterexamples. For example, when you're overly happy, when you're more willing to take risks because you feel that it will simply turn out good, then how are you going to defend this? When you have anger issues and you irrationally, like, punch someone in the face, how are you going to deal with this? How do you think that these are something good irrational actions? They have no justification for this. And then lastly, let's talk about the accessibility within both times. They talked about how, oh, this is going to be accessible because people can, like, logically process what is going to happen, and therefore they could go out and reach for help. Firstly, why does this not happen? Why is this not able to happen on their side? On our side, they said that, like, oh, but like there's stigma, so you guys are not able to reach out. Well, then how are you able to? But also, secondly, when we understand, when we are under the assumption that these individuals already have certain mental capabilities and they're within these types of limitations, how are they going to be able to rationally process all these in the same time and actively go to the government and be like, hey, I need my depression to be erased, or I need you to get rid of my depression because I have logically calculated all of this while I was in depression? We think that this type of accessibility or the fiat of this motion doesn't apply to both sides if they believe that it doesn't actually apply to the opposition side, and that's why I am proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker. Now I'd like to invite the final speaker of today's debate. Government reply. Here.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The op reply says that we need depression so that we can get rid of the elephant in the room. The thing is, our side doesn't have an elephant inside the room in the first place. We get rid of the crux of the problem from the very, very get-go. I'm going to first of all talk about the burdens of both sides and move on to a world comparison. Let's first of all talk about the burdens. Their side keeps on unfairly burden pushing us to prove through and through that extreme emotions themselves are bad, not just depression. Few things. Number one, I think we made it very, very clear throughout all three speakers. This is not our burden in the first place. Sure, if we have the technology to do so, we might consider, analyzing every single emotion and eradicate the certain emotions with extreme ends that might inflict third party and your harms to yourself. The thing is, we don't think that this is our burden in the first place. Sadly, there's not the technology to do this yet, right? This emotionally robust technology to get rid of depression. We think that emotions are not dichotomous. They're not binary. Some lead to, positive and rational outcomes, whereas other leads least to outcomes that are not as rational, right? I think that if we have the technology, we might get rid of things like, I don't know, maybe rage, but that's not a burden to prove to you in today's debate, right? We might do that, we might not. I don't think that we have a burden to justify to you what we're going to do if we're going to all the specifics and technicalities in the first place. But sure, second of all, let's accept the characterization that emotions are, binary and that we're able to like get rid of the extreme versions or whatever. Still, I think that depression is very different from other emotions that we told you about throughout this entire debate. Because depression, we told you, leads to direct third-party harms, it leads to individual harms, it leads to you spiraling into a state in mind in which you want to actively harm yourself and hate yourself. That's an exclusive emotion that's different from anything else. For example, compared to like euphoria, where I don't think that euphoria can actually necessarily drive you to, do things like domestic violence or start actively abusing, like, your family or yourself or whatnot. This is the reason as to why it's so exclusive. They still don't understand it. It's pretty concerning that I'm clarifying this at government reply. They keep on generalizing our entire case to be about irrationality. That's just not the case. I told you about the exclusive aspects of depression that make it so different from any other mental condition. Second of all, let's talk about their best versus our worst case scenario. Sure, you might assign therapists to every single person because the government suddenly decides to reach out to every single depressed person and assign a therapist. Let's be charitable and let them get away with abusing the government fiat by saying that anyone can get a therapist. So I guess like half of the population has to now become a therapist, right? But first of all, sure, even if that's the case, that does not mean that I, as a woman who was raped by my boss, is going to reach out to the therapist, because if I reach out, I'm trembling in fear. Like, for example, what if word gets out that I reached out to a therapist and that makes me get fired because the boss is now mad at me, right? Like, what if people start actively defaming me and laughing at me because of this, right? I think that just like this, they never actually proved to us as to how, just because you improve the accessibility, that does not necessarily mean that people will reach out in the first place. So in other words, even if you offer to us this really naive counter model, you still leave people in despair. You still leave people behind. You don't solve the root cause of the problem in any ways. But second of all, even if all of your benefits sit at the end of the day, that does not mean, that means that there's literally no difference between our two cases. Because while we proved to you many exclusive benefits, about productivity and increased rationality and whatnot, even if all of their benefits stood, that still makes it at ground zero, right? Because ultimately the purpose of all these therapists is to get rid of depression. The purpose of these therapy centers is to cure you from depression. They say that through depression you get other benefits like connections or whatnot. We told you how it's not exclusive. We told you another benefits at the end of the day are exclusive, while they have exclusive harms. More than proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for the speech. This includes the grand final for this year's YTN Huff's General League Middle School debate. Thank you, debaters, for the debate. You may go to the main hall and wait for the closing ceremony. Thank you.